Welcome to this explainer on atomic habits and the aggregation of marginal gains. We so often fall into this trap of believing that massive success absolutely requires massive action. Whether it's losing weight, building a business, or finally chasing down that lifelong dream, we kind of think we need to make some dramatic, exhausting pivot to get there. But today, we're going to dive into how life-altering transformations are actually the result of tiny, everyday routines. We're going to break down the science and the incredible true stories behind James Clear's groundbreaking concepts. Let's get right into it.
To really get a grip on the sheer power of tiny changes, we've got to start our story right in the middle of a seriously chaotic and traumatic moment. During his sophomore year of high school, author James Clear had a baseball bat slip from a classmate's hands and strike him directly between the eyes. He has absolutely no memory of the actual impact, but the physical reality was devastating. The collision sent the soft tissue of his brain slamming into the inside of his skull.
The severity of his injuries was just absolute. In a fraction of a second, his face was literally crushed. This wasn't just a minor sports injury, His body actually began shutting down. He experienced post-traumatic seizures, struggled to even breathe on his own, and as the swelling in his brain escalated, he was eventually placed into a medically induced coma and life-flighted to a larger hospital.
Now, his recovery wasn't some cinematic, overnight miracle montage. It was long, it was slow, and honestly, it was deeply humiliating. 1 full year after the accident, after spending his entire life dreaming of playing professional baseball just like his dad, he returned to the field only to be the only junior cut from the varsity team. He literally sat in his car and cried. He was starting over from absolute rock bottom.
He couldn't control that tragic end to his high school baseball career, right? But going to Denison University 2 years later gave him a much-needed fresh start. This right here is the turning point. It was a brand new environment where, even though he was at the very bottom of the roster as a freshman, he could finally focus on getting his life in order and regaining a sense of agency.
And what's remarkably unglamorous here is exactly how he started. He didn't execute these massive life overhauls. Instead, while his peers were staying up late playing video games in messy dorm rooms, he just went to bed early. He kept his room tidy, he studied, he lifted weights. They seem almost too simple, don't they? But he was building his confidence back up through tiny, totally controllable routines. He was proving to himself that he could manage his own life again.
But the compounding effect of those small choices? Staggering. By just sticking to those basic routines, he transformed from a struggling featherweight 170-pound kid into a lean 200-pound powerhouse. He became the team captain, an ESPN academic All-American, and even won the university's highest academic honor. He didn't have one single defining moment of triumph. Instead, he had thousands of tiny, invisible moments that stacked up into an unimaginable transformation.
And here's the kicker. He used this exact same strategy of starting small when he transitioned into his professional career. He began writing and publishing articles just twice a week. That's it, just 2 articles. But within a few months, that simple habit brought in his first 1,000 subscribers. Fast forward a few years, he was reaching hundreds of thousands of people, signing a major book deal, and running a newsletter with over 500,000 subscribers. The same logic of compounding habits applies to business just as much as it does to biology.
To truly wrap our heads around how this works, let's actually look at the word atomic. It means an impossibly small starting point, a single irreducible unit. But critically, it also means the source of immense energy or power. It's small but incredibly mighty.
Now you combine that immense atomic power with a habit, a routine you perform regularly and automatically, and we realize that accumulating these small but consistent automatic responses ultimately leads to earth-shattering results. When you change your habits, you quite literally change your trajectory. All right, so let's look at a macro case study. Dave Brailsford and British cycling. To prove this theory works on a massive organizational scale, we've got to look at one of the most incredible paradigm-shifting stories in the history of sports. 110. That's the number of years professional British cyclists had endured just absolute grinding mediocrity before Dave Brailsford arrived as their performance director. I mean, since 1908, they had won only one single Olympic gold medal. They had never won a Tour de France. They were performing so poorly that top European bike manufacturers literally refused to sell them gear because they were terrified it would hurt their brand if people saw the Brits riding their bikes. That is rough.
So how exactly do you fix a century of failure? Well, Brailsford's strategy wasn't to look for some dramatic sweeping overhaul. Instead, he implemented a philosophy called the aggregation of marginal gains. The idea was simple but completely revolutionary. break down absolutely everything that goes into riding a brake, and improve every single element by just 1%.
Brailsford and his team started stacking these incredibly weird, tiny, marginal gains. Sure, they redesigned the bike seats, but they also rubbed alcohol on the tires for just a tiny bit more grip. They even had riders wear electrically heated overshorts to maintain the exact right muscle temperature. I mean, just picture the other teams watching them literally plug in their shorts before a race. They accumulated hundreds of these hyper-specific micro-adjustments that absolutely no other team on Earth was even thinking about.
But hey, the payoff was absolutely legendary. After a century of nothing, the aggregation of these tiny 1% improvements led Bradley Wiggins to become the very first British cyclist to win the Tour de France. The very next year, Chris Froome won it. In fact, they secured 5 Tour de France victories in just 6 years. This completely validates the concept that tiny, almost invisible changes really do compound into remarkable, world-beating results.
The integrated model of human behavior. Now that we see why this works, the natural question is, how on earth do we actually build these routines ourselves? To do that, we really need to look at the cognitive and behavioral science behind how habits are formed in the brain.
Clear breaks the whole psychological mechanism down into this incredibly simple 4-step loop. First, there's a cue that triggers your brain, like seeing a fresh cup of coffee sitting on the counter. That leads to a craving, which is the motivational force and desire to feel alert. Then comes the response, the actual habit of drinking the coffee. And finally, the reward, the caffeine hitting your system, which satisfies that craving. If you master this loop and intercept the cues and rewards in your daily routine, you master your behavior.
Now, historically, behavioral scientists focus mostly on external rewards and punishments. But what makes Clear's integrated model such a game changer is that it totally accounts for your internal states. It recognizes that your thoughts, your momentary feelings, and your deeply held beliefs are constantly driving your responses. Think about it. If you feel overwhelmed, your brain is going to crave a much different response than if you feel energized, right? Understanding how your internal mood interacts with those external cues is the real secret to mastering your behavior.
So I want to leave you with this thought today. We've seen how a college student recovered from a traumatic brain injury just by making his bed and studying. We've seen how a national cycling team conquered the world by heating their shorts and rubbing alcohol on their tires. Now that you know the awesome compounding power of aggregating marginal gains, what is the tiny 1% improvement you can make to your own routine today to start compounding your own success? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I'll see you next time.